She never photographed me, always hid me in the corner of photos. You're a nightmarish mistake of nature. But then she started losing her sight and looked at me closely for the first time. Up close. Growing up, I learned to hate my reflection before I even understood what self-image meant. Every morning brought the same ritual, avoiding the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth, keeping my head down in school hallways, finding excuses to skip family gatherings where cameras might appear. My mother had a way of making her observations sound like medical diagnoses rather than insults. She would tilt her head, study my face with the clinical detachment of someone examining a defective product, then deliver her verdict with surgical precision. The hooked nose that dominated my face became a daily topic of discussion at breakfast. She would gesture at it with her coffee spoon, explaining to anyone within earshot how genetics had failed our family line. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, it was how she said them with such casual certainty, as if she were commenting on the weather. She had this habit of comparing my features to various unpleasant things she encountered throughout her day. A rat's face when I was eating. A bird's beak when I was in profile. My small, dark eyes reminded her of buttons sewn onto a raggedy doll. School became my refuge, not because the kids there were kinder, but because their cruelty felt different. When classmates made jokes about my appearance, it stung, but it was the predictable meanness of children testing boundaries. At home, the commentary felt more like slow poisoning, consistent, methodical, and delivered by someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I developed elaborate strategies to minimize my visibility. I became an expert at timing my movements around the house to avoid her direct gaze. I perfected the art of standing behind taller people in group photos, though she rarely included me in pictures anyway. When she did, I would inevitably end up positioned at the edge of the frame, half cut off, as if the camera had naturally rejected my presence. The family photo albums told the story of a woman with friends, relatives, and various pets, but rarely featured her son. I used to flip through those pages when she wasn't home, searching for evidence of my own existence. Occasionally, I would find myself in the background of someone else's moment, a blurry figure at the edge of a birthday party, a shadow lurking behind a Christmas tree. My teenage years brought new levels of self-consciousness. While my classmates worried about acne and awkward growth spurts, I was convinced that my fundamental facial structure was wrong. I started wearing hats pulled low over my forehead, grew my hair longer to hide the sides of my face, and developed a habit of covering my mouth when I laughed. Dating was impossible. How could I pursue relationships when my own mother found my appearance so objectionable? I convinced myself that any interest from the opposite gender was either pity or a cruel joke waiting to be revealed. I became skilled at deflecting attention, making self-deprecating jokes before anyone else could, and generally making myself as invisible as possible. College offered some escape, but I carried her voice with me like a constant internal narrator. Every mirror became an opportunity for her commentary to echo in my head. I avoided photography so completely that my yearbook photo was a disaster. I looked like someone caught mid-panic, which wasn't far from the truth. After graduation, I found work that didn't require much face-to-face interaction. I lived alone, kept my social circle small, and generally structured my life around minimizing opportunities for others to study my appearance too closely. My mother and I maintained a relationship of polite distance, holiday visits, obligatory phone calls, the basic maintenance of family ties without much emotional investment. Update 1. Everything changed when I turned 32. She called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because our conversations typically happened on scheduled Sunday afternoons. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain. She had been having trouble with her vision for several months. At first, she blamed it on aging, on needing stronger reading glasses, on poor lighting in her house. But the problems were getting worse. She was having difficulty reading, couldn't drive at night anymore, and had started bumping into furniture she had lived with for decades. The diagnosis came after weeks of tests and specialist appointments. Macular degeneration, the kind that progresses steadily and doesn't respond well to treatment. The doctor explained that she would lose her central vision gradually, making it harder to see faces, read books, or focus on details. Her peripheral vision would remain, but the sharp, clear sight she had always relied on would fade. I drove to her house the weekend after she shared the news. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, but instead of reading or watching television, she was just staring out at the yard with an expression I had never seen before, something between fear and confusion. For the first time in our relationship, she seemed to need me. Not financially or practically, but emotionally. She was facing the loss of something she had always taken for granted, and suddenly I was no longer the problematic son whose appearance embarrassed her. I was simply someone familiar in a world that was becoming increasingly unclear. We started spending more time together by necessity. She needed help with tasks that required clear vision, sorting mail, reading labels, organizing medications. But something unexpected happened during those mundane activities. Without her sharp, critical gaze constantly cataloging my flaws, our interactions became more natural. She began asking me to describe things she could no longer see clearly. What did the neighbor's new garden look like? What was happening in the television show we were watching? How did I think her hair looked after her salon appointment? These requests forced me to look at the world more carefully, to put observations into words, to engage with visual details I had spent years avoiding. The change was gradual but unmistakable. As her vision decreased, her dependence on me increased, and with it came a softening in her tone. She still made comments about appearances, but they were less frequent and less sharp. Sometimes she would catch herself mid-sentence, as if remembering that visual observations were becoming less reliable for her. One afternoon, while I was helping her organize old photographs, she held up a picture from my childhood. She squinted at it, bringing it close to her face, then farther away, trying to find the right distance for her failing eyes. She asked me to describe the photo to her. It was from a family vacation when I was about 8, one of the few pictures that included me prominently. I was standing next to her on a beach, both of us smiling at the camera. As I described the scene, she kept studying the image, as if trying to reconcile my current voice with the child in the photograph. That was the first time she commented positively on my appearance in any context. She said I had been a cute kid, that she had forgotten how much I looked like her father at that age. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, just a quiet observation, but it marked a shift in how she saw me, or perhaps how she was learning to see me differently. Update 2. By the time she turned 50, her vision had deteriorated significantly. She could still make out shapes and shadows, could navigate familiar spaces with some confidence, but faces had become impossible for her to read from any distance. This created an interesting dynamic in our relationship. For the first time in my life, my appearance was irrelevant to our interactions. She started asking me to sit closer during our visits. Not because she wanted to examine my face critically, but because proximity was the only way she could sense my presence clearly. She would reach out to touch my arm when she was talking, using physical contact to maintain connection in ways she had never done before. The most surprising change was in her storytelling. She began sharing memories from my childhood that I had never heard before, stories that didn't focus on my appearance or behavior, but on moments of connection we had shared. She remembered the time I had helped her plant flowers in the backyard, how patient I had been when she taught me to tie my shoes, the way I used to hum while coloring at the kitchen table. These memories seemed to emerge from some part of her consciousness that her critical nature had previously suppressed. Without the constant visual input that had fed her judgmental observations, she was accessing different aspects of our relationship, remembering interactions that had nothing to do with how I looked. She also started asking me about my life in ways she never had before. What did I do for fun? What made me happy? What were my hopes for the future? These weren't the obligatory questions parents asked to maintain conversational politeness. They felt like genuine curiosity about who I was as a person. I found myself sharing things with her that I had never expected to discuss. My struggles with self-confidence, my difficulty forming relationships, my career choices that prioritized isolation over advancement. She listened without interrupting, without offering the quick judgments that had characterized our previous conversations. One evening, while I was reading to her from a book she had been enjoying, she interrupted to ask me something completely unexpected. She wanted to know if I was happy. Not successful, not accomplished, not meeting her expectations, just happy. The question caught me off guard because it was the first time anyone had asked it in a way that felt genuine. I found myself considering the answer seriously, thinking about aspects of my life I had never examined closely. Was I happy? It was complicated. I had built a life around avoiding pain rather than pursuing joy, around minimizing risks rather than embracing possibilities. As I tried to formulate an honest response, she reached over and found my hand. Her fingers were cool and slightly trembling, and she held on with a gentleness I couldn't remember experiencing from her before. She said she hoped I could find happiness, that she worried she had made it harder for me than it needed to be. This wasn't a dramatic apology or a tearful confession. It was a quiet acknowledgement that our relationship had been shaped by her limitations as much as mine. She couldn't take back the years of criticism, but she could recognize that her perspective had been narrow and perhaps unfair. The real breakthrough came a few weeks later, during what had become our regular Sunday afternoon visits. She was having one of her clearer days, when the progression of her condition seemed to pause temporarily. She asked me to help her with something in the bedroom. She wanted to find a particular piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. While we were searching through her jewelry box, she found an old hand mirror with an ornate silver handle. She held it up instinctively, then realized she couldn't see her reflection clearly anymore. Instead of putting it down, she turned toward me and asked if I would describe what I saw in the mirror. I looked at my reflection and, for the first time in years, tried to see myself objectively rather than through the lens of her previous criticisms. I saw dark hair that was starting to thin slightly at the temples, brown eyes that were perhaps smaller than average but not unattractive, a nose that was prominent but not grotesque, a face that was unremarkable but not hideous. As I described these features to her, she listened with complete attention. When I finished, she asked if she could touch my face. The request was so unexpected that I almost refused. The idea of being examined that closely triggered decades of defensive instincts. But something in her voice made me lean forward and allow her hands to explore my features. Her fingers traced the outline of my nose, felt the shape of my cheekbones, touched the corners of my eyes. She took her time, building a tactile map of my face that her eyes could no longer provide. Final update. When she finished her exploration, she sat back in her chair with an expression I had never seen before. She looked confused, almost surprised, as if she had discovered something unexpected. She told me that my eyes felt like her father's eyes, deep-set and expressive. She said my cheekbones reminded her of her brother, who had been considered the handsome one in their family. The nose that had been the subject of so much criticism throughout my childhood, she now described as strong and distinctive, like the men in her family who had been respected for their character and intelligence. The transformation in her perception was startling. These were the same features she had mocked and criticized for decades, but now she was finding familiar and even positive qualities in them. It was as if losing her sight had forced her to develop new ways of seeing, ways that were more connected to memory and emotion than to superficial judgment. She asked me why I had never told her that I looked like her side of the family. The question revealed something profound about how distorted her vision had been, not just her physical vision, but her emotional and psychological vision. She had been so focused on finding flaws that she had missed the connections and similarities that were apparently obvious to her now. I realized that her criticism of my appearance had never really been about how I looked. It had been about her own discomfort with certain aspects of herself and her family history. My features reminded her of people and characteristics she had complicated feelings about, and rather than examining those feelings, she had projected them onto me. The most surprising moment came when she asked me to bring her a recent photograph of myself. I had to search through my things to find one. I still avoided cameras instinctively. When I finally located a photo from a work event, she held it close to her face, squinting and adjusting the distance until she could make out the basic shapes and shadows. She studied that photo for a long time, longer than she had ever looked at any image of me before. When she finally set it down, she said something that changed everything between us. She said I was handsome, that she could see it now, that she was sorry it had taken her so long to notice. This wasn't pity or compensation for her previous cruelty. She meant it genuinely, and I could hear the surprise in her own voice, as if she was discovering something about me that had always been there but had somehow remained invisible to her. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She had to lose her sight to truly see me. Her physical blindness had freed her from the mental blindness that had shaped our entire relationship. Without the ability to focus on surface details and perceived flaws, she was finally able to perceive me as a whole person rather than a collection of disappointing features. Over the following months, our relationship continued to evolve. She began including me in family events more naturally, stopped making excuses about my appearance to relatives, and even started asking for copies of recent photos to keep in her room. She couldn't see them clearly, but having them seemed important to her, as if she was trying to make up for all the years when she had excluded me from the family's visual history. The changes weren't just about appearance. As she let go of her superficial judgments about how I looked, she also became more open to other aspects of who I was. She started asking about my interests, my opinions, my experiences. She discovered that I was funny, that I was thoughtful, that I had insights and perspectives she had never bothered to explore. I found myself changing too. Without the constant weight of her disapproval, I began to see myself differently. I started making eye contact with people more naturally, stopped avoiding mirrors compulsively, and even began to consider that other people might not see me the way she had conditioned me to believe they would. The relationship between us became more balanced. I was no longer just the disappointing son whose appearance embarrassed her. I was a person she genuinely enjoyed spending time with, someone whose company she sought out for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation or necessity. Looking back now, I understand that her cruelty about my appearance had never been about me at all. It had been about her own insecurities, her own fears about what other people might think, her own inability to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. When she lost her physical sight, she was forced to develop different ways of perceiving and valuing people. The boy who had hidden from cameras and avoided mirrors grew into a man who could look at himself with something approaching acceptance. Not because my appearance had changed, but because I had learned to see myself through new eyes that were focused on character and connection rather than superficial perfection. She never explicitly apologized for the years of criticism, and I never directly confronted her about the damage it had caused. But in the quiet moments when she would reach for my hand or ask me to describe something beautiful she could no longer see clearly, there was an understanding between us that acknowledged both the pain of our past and the possibility of a different kind of relationship. The most profound realization was that I had never been the problem. My appearance had never been as flawed as she had made me believe. Her vision had been distorted by her own limitations, and when those limitations forced her to find new ways of seeing, she discovered that I had always been worthy of love and acceptance. Now, when I look in mirrors, I sometimes see the features she finally learned to appreciate: my grandfather's eyes, my uncle's strong profile, the family resemblances that connect me to a history larger than her narrow judgments. I see a face that tells the story of where I came from, rather than a collection of flaws that need to be hidden or fixed. The damage from those formative years can never be completely undone. I still feel echoes of that old self-consciousness, still catch myself avoiding certain angles and photographs, still struggle with the deep-seated belief that my appearance is somehow problematic. But now I also carry the knowledge that perception can change, that love can emerge from unexpected places, and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are simply trapped in ways of seeing that limit their ability to recognize our worth. She still lives with her progressive vision loss, but she has found ways to navigate the world that don't depend on sharp sight. And I have found ways to navigate my own life that don't depend on her approval or disapproval. We have both learned to see differently, and in that shared transformation, we discovered a relationship that neither of us had imagined was possible.